For the last several years, the stars of the NBA in the 60s have not been getting nearly the credit they deserve for their accomplishments that paved the way for today's stars. We were being told that the game was uncompetitive, the players had no skill, they were unathletic plumbers, and that the average player today would average 60 points per game if they played back then. I'm here to expose the biggest lies about the 1960s NBA. Lie number 1, the players back then were unathletic. We hear it a lot that the players today are so much more athletic. Actually, we just have way better equipment, better medical treatment, and the schedules back then were far more grueling than they are today. The players back then played in Chuck Taylors. I can't imagine those even being comfortable to walk down the streets in without modern insoles, let alone play professional basketball in. It's true that advances in sports and medical science have evolved in the last 6 decades, so the players you see today would not have been as strong or as durable if they played in the 60s. Guys have longer careers now than they did back then, but the whole medical staff for an entire team was only one athletic trainer and an assistant coach in the 60s. That was it. Not having private jets or hotel beds to accommodate for these players' enormous bodies definitely couldn't help them either. There was also no load management or guaranteed contracts back then, and guys had to play games on back-to-back days a lot more often than we see now. Unless you couldn't walk, you were expected to play even when hurt. If you didn't, you'd get cut and no one else would want to pick you up. That's why guys back then couldn't play past their mid-30s, and now LeBron James is still a top 10 to 15 player as the oldest player in the league at 40 years old, and Stephen Curry and Kevin Durant still have plenty of years left in them at 37 and 36 respectively. Wilt Chamberlain averaged 48.5 minutes per game for the entire 1961-62 season. People who criticize his minutes as a ploy to pad his stats, let me ask you this. Even if that was true, if playing that many minutes per game for a whole season was so easy, why does nobody today in the load management era without nearly as many back-to-back games even play 40 minutes per game? Just for the record though, I don't encourage any coaches to play anybody no matter who it is every single minute of every game for an entire season. Still, if anything, Wilt being able to do that should prove he was an absolute superhuman to have that kind of endurance. You can argue there were better players in NBA history than Wilt, but when it comes to physical gifts and nothing else, nobody was more physically gifted than Wilt Chamberlain. He is the reason why nowadays a free throw shooter has to wait until the ball hits the rim to be allowed to move. Wilt was even so unbelievably athletic that after his NBA career, he played professional volleyball briefly in his late 30s, and he ended up being a Hall of Famer in volleyball too. It wasn't just Wilt that was such a spectacular athlete from that era though. Did you know Jerry West was able to touch the top of the backboard square?
Everything I heard about Elgin, everything I read about Elgin was that he was Dr. J, Michael Jordan before Dr. J, Michael Jordan. He gets to the basket, he do all these incredible things in the air. But I want to know, how did he get to the basket? It's cool to be able to do all those fancy things, but how did he get there?
Bill Russell has jumped over someone from the free throw line. He and Wilt Chamberlain were track and field stars before they played basketball. Did you know John Havlicek, the greatest sixth man of all time in the 60s, was drafted by the Cleveland Browns as a wide receiver? Why didn't we see anyone dunk on one another back then? It wasn't because these guys weren't capable of it. Actually, it was seen as unsportsmanlike at the time, and it would have gotten you laid out the next time you got the ball. Lie number 2, the players of the 60s were not skilled. Today, Mac McClung, the reigning 3-time dunk contest champion, is a career G-leaguer. Anyone who thinks someone like him would have been a star in the 60s, actually, he would have been a full-time plumber, because back then they didn't have a G League and there was no dunking culture like we have now. What else can Mac McClung even rely on besides his leaping ability? The rules and the playing conditions of the 60s also made a huge difference in the way guys played. These guys were way more skilled than they would look without knowing these things. Dribbling rules were a lot stricter back then. Your palm had to be facing down. or else it was a carry. It's not officially in the rules, but it's just how the game was called back then. This was true in the 70s too. Look at this clip of Randy Smith doing what looks very normal now, but yeah, that was called a carry. There eventually came a time when the NBA decided to embrace the entertainment aspect of basketball more, so they loosened up on what a carry is. Even with modern dribbling rules, the basketballs that were used back then were harder to dribble because they didn't have as much bounce, so dribbling required more force. Despite the stricter carrying rules and the heavier leather basketball, Bob Cousy was known as the Houdini of the hardwood for his wizardry with the ball. Walt Frazier may have had his best years in the 70s, but he came up in the late 60s and was another guy who should be mentioned among the best ball handlers of all time too, in spite of these rules. Not only that, offensive fouls were called a lot more strictly back then. A lot of the best players now get criticized for foul baiting. Back then, they would get called for an offensive foul every single time if they tried it. The way offensive fouls were called back then and how crowded the painted area was compared to today made finishing at the rim harder, yet they were still guys who were great at it. A lot of guys had weird shooting forms in the 60s, but there have been successful players in more recent years like Shawn Marion, Joakim Noah, and Tyrese Halliburton, whose forms don't look so pretty either. Or in the 80s and 90s, Bill Cartwright's form just ugh. Here's the thing about some of these guys like Paul Arizin, Bob Cousy, or Willie Knowles, who didn't have the prettiest form or great field goal percentages. Those guys still shot 80% from the foul line, and if they had the benefit of having shooting coaches, which were not a thing back then, they probably would have become some of the best shooters ever. The fast-paced style of play in the 60s also contributed to the low field goal percentages. I firmly believe having a mid-range game matters a lot and always will because it makes you less predictable, but back then, mid-range shots were king because there was no three-point line and because they played with heavier leather balls and the lighting in the arena was not very good, they developed their forms to survive, not to look aesthetically pleasing. Most players also learned the game on playgrounds, not polished gyms. The 60s had way more emphasis on fundamentals than flash. If the rules allowed fancy crossovers and if there was a three-point line, of course these guys could have done the things we see today. That's the problem with today's game though. Too many guys over dribble rather than dribble with a purpose and shoot too many threes. You know it wasn't just Michael Jordan that Kobe got his moves from, right? He studied Jerry West, Elgin Baylor, and Oscar Robertson too. I remember watching this segment of him analyzing the legends he got his moves from during the 2010 NBA playoffs. Do you actually think Kobe couldn't tell the difference between a legend and an average Joe? Why would he even bother watching their film and analyzing it if they weren't any good? Those of us who watched at least most of Kobe's career, when seeing some footage of Jerry West, no way was it just Jordan who he got his impeccable pump fake from. Jerry West had that before either of them were even born. Kobe, as a guy who was revered for his impeccable footwork, talked about Elgin Baylor having great footwork. He learned his great footwork from a plumber? There were many other great players from that era who are less well known than the ones I already mentioned. Will Chamberlain considered Guy Rodgers to be the best ball handler he's ever seen, even better than Bob Cousy, the Houdini of the hardwood. Al Attles, who played alongside Rodgers and Wilt on the Warriors, said he never worried about the defender covering him, no matter how great, because he was able to see the whole court and made the proper pass. Attles has also said, "I don't know if Guy was the best point guard or playmaker, but I don't know who was any better." Hal Greer was a 10-time All-Star who averaged at least 20 points per game in 8 different seasons and was the leading scorer on the 1967 Sixers during the playoffs when Wilt finally overcame Bill Russell's Celtics and won his first championship. Greer's pull-up jumper was so smooth they called him Mr. Jump Shot. You think no point guards back then had a finishing package even remotely like Kyrie Irving? Check out Lenny Wilkins, who was also very crafty with his finishing at the rim, but had to do it while driving into much more crowded painted areas than we see today. He was a great floor general too. On defense, he was great at anticipating plays before they happened and was really good at disrupting his opponent's rhythm. His intelligence on the court is what made him become a player coach later on and go on to have a Hall of Fame coaching career after his Hall of Fame playing career. Now for some even lesser known players from that era, starting with Wally Wonder Jones. He was never even an all-star, but still a great floor general and someone Magic Johnson idolized as a kid, so he had to do something right. Just open up the highlights of the 1967 finals and you'll see him dribble behind his back. Keeping in mind the dribbling rules that existed back then, that was a lot harder to do back then. He was able to shoot from pretty deep before the three-point line was implemented too. He wasn't just some spot-up shooter either. He shot well off the dribble. He didn't average a lot of assists, but if you watch some of his passes without looking at Basketball Reference, you would think he was always among the league leaders in assists. When Larry Costello, the Sixers' longtime point guard, got hurt, the Sixers' new head coach at the time, Alex Hannum, gave Wally Wonder Jones more opportunities, and he averaged 17.5 points per game in that playoff run and 20.2 points per game during the finals. Lucius Jackson was shattering backboards before Darryl Dawkins or Shaq ever did. Long before weightlifting was implemented in the NBA, he was 6'9", 240 pounds, not far from what LeBron is. Rudy LaRusso, who played for the Lakers for much of his career before spending his final 2 seasons with the San Francisco Warriors, is another guy not a lot of people today might know, but he was a 5-time All-Star and made the All-Defensive second team in the last season of his career, which was the first season All-Defensive teams were even a thing. He retired when he was just 31 years old and averaged 20 points per game in his final 2 seasons with the Warriors. By the way, the reason he retired so prematurely was that as a Dartmouth graduate, he saw the opportunity to make more money as an investment banker and sports agent. NBA salaries were nothing like they are now. Wilt was the highest paid player in 1969 with just $250,000 for the season. Back to some Hall of Famers though, the mid and late 60s is when some 70s legends like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Walt Clyde Frazier, Willis Reed, Earl the Pearl Monroe, Rick Barry, and Wes Unseld were drafted. Line number 3, Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain were the only great centers because they were way bigger than everyone. It is true that the average height of the NBA now is taller than the average height was in the 60s, but it's only taller by 2 inches. To think Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain had no other competition, that's just a lazy way to analyze that era. Bill Russell was just under 7 feet tall at 6'10", and Wilt was 7'1", but they were not the only 2 giants in the NBA and still had plenty of competition at the center position. Nate Thurmond was 6'11" and was drafted in 1963. He played until 1977 and averaged over 20 points per game for 5 seasons while averaging 15 rebounds per game for his whole career. He even had back-to-back seasons of averaging 20 plus rebounds per game. His scoring average only dropped down to 15 because in his final 3 seasons, his focus shifted more to defense and leadership. Thurmond was well known in the 70s for really holding his own, guarding a young Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who came into the league when Thurmond was already 28. Thurmond is also one of just 4 players in league history to ever have a quadruple-double in a game, something he achieved in 1974, the first year blocks and steals were tracked. If only they were tracked in the 60s, he and Bill Russell probably could have done it then too. Wilt Chamberlain must have done it several times in the 60s. Walt Bellamy, who was 6'11", averaged 31 points per game as a rookie, which to this day is still the second highest scoring average by a rookie behind Wilt Chamberlain, and he also averaged 19 rebounds per game that year. He was incredibly strong as someone who competed in shot put and discus in high school. You think big men who can shoot was just some new invention when Dirk Nowitzki came into the league? Here's Walt Bellamy for you. How about those who were actually 7 feet tall besides Wilt? Okay, Walter Dukes was 7 feet tall and received MVP votes twice in his career. He had a 4-year stretch of averaging at least 13 rebounds per game. The rest of the centers I'm about to mention, they may not have been 7 feet tall, but they were great nonetheless. Willis Reed, for example. It may not have been until 1970 when he became an MVP and a champion. However, he had an immediate impact as a rookie, averaging 19.5 points per game and 14.7 rebounds per game in the 1964-65 season. Again, big men who can shoot? Yeah, Willis Reed had range. There's also Wayne Embry, who made 4 All-Star games during this time period. He was only a 6'8 center, but was incredibly strong, weighing 240 pounds, which got him the nickname The Wall. For those who like to act like 60s players were so much smaller than today's players, Embry's bigger than Draymond Green, who the Warriors use as a small ball center in certain situations. Embry had a pretty good mid-range shot too. Lastly, there's the original Big Z, not Zydrunas Ilgauskas, Zelmo Beatty, who was another undersized center, but a great one. He was a constant double-double threat who had a soft hook shot and mid-range shot, both of which he was able to make over 2 defenders at once, the ability to play bully ball, and was a great pick-and-roll big man. On defense, his thick frame allowed him to get great positioning in the post with a low center of gravity. Line number 4. The 60s were a joke because there were only 8 teams. If you want to argue that, think about this. Today we have the G League. Back then there was the Continental Basketball League, otherwise known as the CBA, and here's the difference. NBA teams didn't control CBA teams, so there was no structured pipeline, no call-ups or two-way contracts. Even today, yeah, the G League doesn't operate like baseball's minor leagues, where even the best of the best would begin their professional careers. Even the guys who had to spend some time in the G League before succeeding at the NBA level, like Chris Middleton, Pascal Siakam, and Norman Powell, likely wouldn't have even made it past training camp if the NBA were still structured the way it was in the 60s, with a much lower tolerance for injuries and inconsistency. There was no load management either, so you couldn't just get a G League player called up to fill up a roster spot like you can now. The 1962-63 Celtics had 7 Hall of Fame players on their team. Bill Russell and John Havlicek are the 2 most notable ones, but I'd argue that Sam Jones was a top 5 shooting guard of all time. Jerry West isn't the only 60s player to be known as Mr. Clutch. Sam Jones was also a Mr. Clutch. Jones was a sharpshooter who also had the ability to blow by his defenders, so you couldn't get too close up on him to guard his jumper. He was a lockdown defender too. You may be wondering, how did Casey Jones end up in the Hall of Fame when he never even averaged 10 points per game in a season? His defense is what was rewarded. You can check out his 1966 highlights of him putting the clamps on guys like Jerry West and Oscar Robertson, despite being smaller than both. Satch Sanders was another guy who was rewarded for defense. He actually averaged double-digit scoring numbers more often than not, but not by very much. He made his first all-defensive team at the age of 30, which was the year all defensive teams were introduced, so imagine how many he would have made if all defensive teams existed before he was 30. Tommy Heinsohn, who had a really pretty looking jump shot, was playing in his final season at the age of 30 due to a chronic foot problem with medical treatment that was absolutely terrible compared to today. In the early 60s, Heinsohn averaged over 20 points per game 3 years in a row. These Celtics didn't just have it easy when winning all those championships. Bill Russell played in 10 Game 7s, 5 of them being in the finals. He won all 10 of them. Still, to even play in that many Game 7s, even with all those Hall of Famers around him, that should say a lot about the guys they went up against. They weren't even favored to win Bill Russell and Sam Jones' very last championship in 1969 against the Lakers. The Celtics were also the lowest seeded team to ever win a championship at the time. With just 8 teams, every team had to play each other a lot more often than they do now. So Bill Russell had to face Wilt Chamberlain 10 times a year, or Jerry West and Elgin Baylor's Lakers 10 times a year. This actually made scouting reports razor sharp even without modern technology, because these teams got to learn each other's weaknesses more easily by seeing each other a lot more often every year. The worst teams back then also had much more star power than the worst teams now. The Chicago Packers, for example, in their inaugural season, I'm not making that name up actually, the team that is the Washington Wizards today, had Walt Bellamy, who, as I mentioned earlier, averaged 31 points per game as a rookie. No one on the Washington Wizards or Utah Jazz last season even sniffed that. Imagine if we eliminated 22 teams today and put as many of their best players on the remaining 8. Think about how stacked those 8 teams would be. Before the Cincinnati Royals, who are now the Sacramento Kings, drafted Oscar Robertson, they had Jack Twyman averaging 25.8 points per game in 1959 and 31.2 points per game in 1960 for them, while winning just 19 games in both of those seasons. In the Big O's rookie season, the team improved to 33-46, and the Big O averaged 30 points per game as a rookie, while Twyman still averaged 25 while taking a backseat to the Big O. The Royals eventually became a perennial playoff team with the development of the Big O, Jerry Lucas, and Wayne Embry, but they still had teams that would look stacked today in the years they were rebuilding in the early 60s. Before Bailey Howell helped Bill Russell win his last 3 championships with the Celtics, he was averaging over 20 points per game on some bad Pistons teams. He still managed to average 20 on the 67 Celtics while playing alongside Sam Jones and John Havlicek. The late 50s and early 60s, the Pistons also had another all-star in Gene Shue, who was known for being a tenacious defender and his acrobatic style of play on offense. He is also the one who invented the spin move. The Knicks had Richie Guerin in the early 60s, before Walt Frazier and Willis Reed made them champions in the early 70s. He averaged as many as 29.5 points per game on a Knicks team that was just 29-51 in 1962, the team that Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points against. 2 seasons before that, while playing for the Knicks, who finished just 27-48 that season, he set a then franchise record 57 points in a game, which would be broken in 1984 by Bernard King, and then in 2014 by Carmelo Anthony and Jalen Brunson last year. Those Knicks also had Willie Knowles, who was a 4-time All-Star who averaged 21 to 25 points per game for 3 straight seasons. He was another guy who, as I mentioned earlier, had a weird looking jump shot, but it was effective. Anyone who points to the fact that he shot just 40.6% from the field for his career and never shot 43% or better, let's just keep in mind the less favorable rims that existed back then and the heavier leather basketballs that were used. He was a great rebounder too, averaging over 10 per game for 5 straight seasons as a 6'6 forward. Line number 5, Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game was fake.
You think Wilt actually scored 100?
No.
Yeah,
I don't.
Dude, that's my NBA conspiracy. I
don't.
100% do not believe that he scored 100.
Yep, I don't either.
I can't wait to hold up the sign with my grandkids that I scored 101 points in the game before.
Just because we don't have footage of it means it's fake? It's good that some people at least know well enough to not believe everything you read, but this was a real event that I've only heard disputed in recent years, so it's ridiculous to think anyone would only speak up now and not back then. There were over 4,000 people in attendance, which is certainly marginal compared to today's NBA games attendances, but that's still more than enough people to think someone would speak up if there was even remotely any suspicion that Wilt's points were miscounted. This was before the NBA was considered a major sport like it is today. This was just a regular season game that nobody knew would be so historic beforehand. Even if anybody knew that, the league didn't understand how to capitalize on something historic like this. There was no media strategy or highlight culture in the early 60s. NBA games were televised back then, but not consistently, and that was not a game that was televised. College basketball and Major League Baseball were more popular, therefore it was only right to send cameras to those venues instead. Many arenas, such as Hershey Sports Arena, which is where Wilt's 100-point game happened, were not built with TV in mind. This venue was also made for hockey, not basketball, and wasn't even the Philadelphia Warriors' official home arena. We also have a radio broadcast to prove that Wilt did actually score 100 points in a game.
The rebound, Luckenbill. Back to Luckwood. In the table.
Oh, here's a box score from that game too. Not just from Basketball Reference, but one from what actually counted the stats in real time. Daryl Imhoff, who likely guarded Wilt for most of that game since he was the Knicks starting center at the time, believes it. Listen to this.
Every one of his fadeaways hit up high on the board, hit the ring, fell in. He was just shooting a phenomenal percentage.
Wilt was already averaging 50 points per game for the season prior to scoring 100. He only scored less than 30 twice during that entire season, and those 2 games, he scored 28 and 26 points. 2 of his 6 career 70-plus point games happened just months before he scored 100. He scored 67, 65, and 61 points in the 3 games leading up to his 100-point game. Those 3 games were not televised either. Neither were his 5 other games where he scored at least 70. Anyone who still thinks Wilt never actually scored 100 points in a game because the game wasn't televised and we don't have footage, do you think Julius Caesar's assassination was not real? There may not be any footage of it, yet no historians actually dispute it. At least with Wilt's 100-point game, there are eyewitness accounts, but none for Julius Caesar's assassination. Just because there's no footage of the event does not mean it did not happen. Line number 6, the final one of this video. Bill Russell only has 11 rings because he played for a stacked team. It's true that Bill Russell played for some great teams, but to say that's the only reason he won 11 rings is quite disrespectful. The Celtics were good in the 50s, but they did not win their first championship until Bill Russell arrived. He made his teammates better. 50s Celtics like Bill Sharman and Frank Ramsey had their best seasons with Bill Russell as their teammate. John Havlicek, Sam Jones, and Tommy Heinsohn saw their production increase over the years with Russell as their teammate. Russell may not have been the leading scorer on any of his teams because he allowed Sam Jones or John Havlicek to take care of that. And you know what else? Whoever was the leading scorer on those Celtics teams, they didn't score that many more points than the second leading scorer, and that's because of Bill Russell's leadership. He made it a point to his team that winning matters more than stats, and everyone else followed. It didn't matter to him that centers like Wilt Chamberlain or Walt Bellamy were scoring a lot more than he was. He was capable of putting the ball in the basket when he needed to, and had 2 championship runs where he averaged over 20 points per game for the playoffs. He never prioritized scoring because he was more about team dynamics and letting others get in a rhythm for the better of the team. Even without scoring the most points on any of his teams, Russell still averaged 22 rebounds per game for his whole career. He also did things that did not show up in the box score because that's not what mattered to him. He was a great outlet passer, which was key for the Celtics because of the fast-paced game that was played in the 60s, and was a great screen setter. He also blocked a lot of shots, but we'll never know exactly how many because blocks weren't tracked back then. Resilience also played a key factor for Bill Russell's 11 rings, since life was not even a little bit easy for him off the court. Bill Russell and his black teammates very unfortunately had to endure extreme racial abuse. Bill Russell had his home vandalized, he received death threats, and even had fans from the home crowd in Boston shout racial slurs at him while he was winning championships for the Celtics. He and his black teammates were often denied entry at hotels and restaurants because of their race. Worst of all, none of this despicable behavior was ever punished. Still, these guys balled out on the basketball court, still showed up to play in front of the fans who treated them so horribly, and didn't pay nearly the amount of money that guys pay to see a sporting event today. And for that, Bill Russell made a very strong case for himself as the GOAT. If you came into this video thinking players of the 60s were unskilled or unathletic, I hope if you're still watching this now, you understand that the players from the 60s were tough, resilient, and amazing athletes. Whether you want to say the players today are better than they were back then is subjective, but let's be very clear that these guys were not bums. No, the worst player in the NBA now would not dominate back then. He more than likely wouldn't have even made it to the NBA back then. That's it for this video. What do you make of all this? Do you think I missed anything? Please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more from me, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications to never miss out. If you're already subscribed, thanks so much for your support as always. And if you're a new subscriber, welcome to the team. Links to my social media are down below for my more immediate reactions to what's going on in the sports world. If you'd like to see my most recent video and the one that YouTube recommends, both are up above. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.